In August 1964, under a moonless sky in the Gulf of Tonkin, two American destroyers, USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, opened fire in a chaotic frenzy. Radar operators reported incoming torpedoes, sonar screens lit up with mysterious signals, and gun crews unleashed over 300 shells into the darkness. The North Vietnamese Navy, it seemed, had launched a daring assault. But questions lingered. The supposed enemy vessels vanished without a trace, no wreckage was ever found, and doubts about the radar and sonar reports began to grow. This ambiguous incident, shrouded in confusion and controversy, would soon become the justification for one of the most divisive wars in history. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident wasn't just a skirmish, it became the spark that set the Vietnam War ablaze, a war that reshaped global politics and claimed millions of lives. Was it a calculated provocation, a misunderstanding, or a deliberate manipulation? Today, we unravel the events of that fateful night and uncover the truth behind one of history's most debated moments. When the United States unleashes the full force of its modern arsenal during the Vietnam War, it does so with confidence in its military strength and its commitment to the anti-communist cause. Yet, it soon finds itself grappling with an underestimated adversary, a war expanding beyond its original scope and mounting political unrest back home. Meanwhile, North Vietnam stands equally confident. For decades, they have fought for an independent and unified Vietnam. To them, the Americans and their allies are merely the latest in a long line of opponents in Ho Chi Minh's enduring struggle. As the conflict spreads across the jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, it becomes clear that sheer military power will not secure victory in this quagmire. The roots of the Vietnam War trace back to 1954, when the First Indochina War between French colonial forces and Ho Chi Minh's communist revolutionaries concluded with the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. In the subsequent Geneva Accords, a temporary division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel was established by major global powers, including the United States, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. This division creates two states: the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist state of Vietnam in the south, headed by former Emperor Bao Dai. The agreement stipulates national reunification through elections planned for 1956. For Ho Chi Minh, this compromise falls short of his goal for a united Vietnam. Nevertheless, his Chinese and Soviet allies pressure him to accept the terms to avoid further US involvement in the region. For France, the Accords provide a way to exit an unpopular war and quietly relinquish control of the area. Ultimately, the Geneva Accords serve the interests of the major powers, but fail to address the aspirations of Vietnamese nationalists. While the US actively participates in the talks, it downplays its involvement publicly, framing itself as a mere interested observer. Washington is deeply concerned about the concessions made to the communists and had previously supported France militarily during the Indochina War. Although the US refrained from direct intervention at Dien Bien Phu, CIA pilots delivered supplies to the besieged French forces. With France now withdrawing, President Eisenhower ramps up support for the state of Vietnam, seeing it as an opportunity to back an independent government without colonial ties. Despite the planned elections, the US embarks on a nation-building initiative in the South. The primary driver of American involvement is the fear of communist expansion. In the eyes of US policymakers, Ho Chi Minh is perceived as a Soviet puppet, and the fall of Vietnam could trigger a domino effect across Southeast Asia, spreading communism to Laos, Cambodia, India, Burma, Thailand, and potentially even Australia. With French administrators departing, the US identifies Ngo Dinh Diem, Bao Dai's prime minister, as the most promising alternative to Ho Chi Minh. Diem, although lacking charisma, is staunchly anti-French, a Catholic nationalist, and vehemently anti-communist. Washington hopes he can, under their guidance, implement democratic reforms and curtail communism's advance. However, not all American leaders are convinced about Diem or the state of Vietnam. General Matthew Ridgway, a decorated commander from World War II and Korea, voices strong opposition to the U.S. commitment, fearing it will lead to another prolonged ideological conflict in Asia that cannot be resolved with military force alone. Diem's commitment to democracy also raises doubts. In October 1955, he ousts Bao Dai through a referendum in which he reportedly secures 98.91% of the vote, a result met with skepticism in Washington. Yet his recent successes in suppressing communist insurgents, criminal organizations, and militant religious groups earn him U.S. support. Around this time, American military advisors begin arriving in South Vietnam, accompanied by CIA operatives. U.S. financial assistance flows into the region, totaling about $250 million annually in the late 1950s, equivalent to approximately $2.75 billion today. However, the majority of these funds, nearly 80%, are allocated to military needs, primarily to strengthen the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, with little investment in South Vietnam's economic development. Armed with these resources, Diem tightens his grip on power. By 1956, he replaced traditional village leaders with officials loyal to Saigon, further consolidating his control. Many village leaders are thought to harbor communist sympathies, but their removal leads to rural discontent. Re-education programs and slow land reform don't help matters. There's also a security clampdown. By 1958, Saigon has arrested 25,000 people and 90% of the Communist Party's most important members in the South. Diem's Decree 1059 outlaws most opposition and refuses to recognize communist resistance against the French. A Saigon newspaper carries his declaration. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party pursued communist objectives and sought to turn Vietnam into a colony and the Vietnamese into the slaves of red imperialism. They are communists, traitors, and agents of Russia and China. Diem's security forces, often minority Catholics, also target middle-class intellectuals and Buddhists, who they see as centers of political opposition. Diem makes it clear that he will not honor the 1956 unification referendum, as promised by the Geneva Accords, because he claims that no free election can happen in the communist North. The US approves, but largely because they expect Ho Chi Minh to easily win. Instead, Eisenhower invites Diem to Washington to show support. Diem is an example for people everywhere who hate tyranny and love freedom. Meanwhile, in the North, frustration is building. Ho Chi Minh officially forbids Southern communists from committing violence, and instead concentrates on propaganda and building up the North. Estimates vary, but while enacting land reforms, Northern government agents execute around 15,000 North Vietnamese as supposed evil landlords and subversive elements. Ho's commander-in-chief, General Pha Nguyen Gia, later admits the crimes. We made too many deviations and executed too many honest people. Worse still, torture came to be regarded as a normal practice during party reorganization. Ho now faces pressure to increase military activity in the South. Some Southern communist groups are already ignoring his orders for nonviolence, and military leaders are increasingly sidelining their own political leader. In 1959, the North officially supported a protracted arms struggle to overthrow the US Diem regime. They infiltrate thousands of fighters and weapons into the South via the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. In 1960, Vietnamese nationalists formed the National Liberation Front. Initially a broad organization of communists and non-communists, it closely cooperates with the Communist People's Liberation Armed Forces. Collectively, they became known as the Viet Cong, a short form of the words Vietnamese Communists in Vietnamese. The name is used by Saigon newspapers to differentiate the Southern insurgency groups from the Northern Regular People's Army of Vietnam. But practically, the Northern Communist Party controls both organizations. Despite this, most of the NLF's members are native Southern Vietnamese re-infiltrated from the north. Despite their basic equipment, writer Le Ly Hayslip, who grew up in rural southern Vietnam, claims the Viet Cong had an important advantage over the urban and Catholic-dominated ARVN. In contrast to the ARVN, the Viet Cong were, for the most part, our neighbors. They did not insult us because they had been raised exactly like us. Where the Republicans came into a village overburdened with American equipment designed for a different war, the Viet Cong made do with what they had and seldom wasted their best ammunition, the goodwill of the people. As the Viet Cong continues to grow in strength, they intensify their sabotage campaigns, prompting grave warnings from U.S. officials. Edward Lansdale, a counterinsurgency pioneer and U.S. intelligence officer, delivers a dire message to Washington. ARVN is in critical condition. The Viet Cong have started to steal the country and expect to be done in 1961. Lansdale's proposed solution is to increase U.S. support for Ngo Dinh Diem. However, within the administration, confidence in Diem is dwindling, with many doubting his ability to lead. Despite this, there seems to be no viable alternative to replace him. The arrival of a new president ushers in a shift in Vietnam policy. John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, stepping into a volatile global climate. Just before his inauguration, the Soviet Union declared its intent to back all movements engaged in so-called wars of national liberation. In response, Kennedy uses his inaugural address to deliver a resolute message. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Kennedy introduces a new military strategy known as the Flexible Response Doctrine. Unlike the rigid reliance on nuclear deterrence, this approach emphasizes the use of both conventional and covert forces. Kennedy's immediate goal is not to defeat North Vietnam outright, but to enable South Vietnam to withstand the growing insurgency and eventually take charge of its own security. Kennedy also brings a fresh team of advisors into his administration, often referred to as his wise men. These individuals hail from diverse backgrounds, including the military, government, business, finance, and academia. Among them, Robert McNamara stands out as particularly influential. A former manager at Ford Motor Company, McNamara is celebrated for his analytical, data-driven approach, credited with revitalizing the automaker. As Secretary of Defense, Kennedy tasks McNamara with applying his meticulous management style to national security. Encouraged by his advisors, Kennedy decides to increase the number of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. By 1962, their numbers have swelled to 11,300, more than 10 times the figure during Eisenhower's presidency. Although the Geneva Agreement prohibits any state from deploying military personnel to either Vietnamese government, the U.S. advisors find ways to navigate this restriction. Officially classified as non-combat personnel, they carry personal weapons and are permitted to act in self-defense while in Vietnam. These advisors perform various roles. Some are attached to the ARVN as training staff, while others, such as Special Forces personnel, operate under the guise of civilian contractors. Over time, many serve as helicopter pilots, transporting ARVN troops into combat. As the number of advisors grows, the U.S. constructs camps, barracks, and helicopter bases throughout South Vietnam. Although the ARVN continues to conduct most of the fighting, often using surplus U.S. World War II-era weapons, U.S. advisors occasionally join patrols and sometimes suffer casualties. To manage this expanding force, Kennedy establishes the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, a centralized command structure to oversee U.S. operations in South Vietnam. By September 1962, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, shifted its focus to a new strategy: the establishment of strategic hamlets. These specially fortified villages are designed to isolate rural populations from communist influence. The U.S. entices villagers to relocate to these secure areas by offering promises of material benefits. improved services, and ideological protection. By this time, approximately 4.3 million villagers are living in 3,000 strategic hamlets. This effort, combined with counterinsurgency operations, covert patrols, and an increase in airstrikes against the Viet Cong, fosters a sense of optimism among U.S. officials. However, despite the enhanced firepower, the Viet Cong proved to be a resilient adversary. U.S. helicopters, a cornerstone of counterinsurgency strategy, become prime targets. As Lieutenant Colonel Archie Clapp recalls from 1962, the helicopter flight landed troops in their encircling positions. 8 of the 22 helicopters were hit at least once. Why, we wanted to know, were we subjected to this heavy opposition when we were landing on the heel of an airstrike? We concluded that it was not in spite of, but because of the airstrike. When the airstrike started, the VC grabbed their guns and headed out of town to the intended helicopter landing sites. In January 1963, the Viet Cong achieved their most significant victory yet at the Battle of Amp Bac. A force of about 350 guerrillas successfully defeats a much larger ARVN unit. They repel flamethrower-equipped armored personnel carriers and manage to shoot down 5 U.S. helicopters. This battle shocks U.S. advisors, who are unprepared for the Viet Cong's ability to hold their ground against airstrikes, armored vehicles, and napalm. At the same time, the ARVN demonstrates poor leadership and a lack of morale, undermining the effectiveness of their superior training, equipment, and American support. Compounding U.S. challenges, 1963 brings increased social and political unrest in South Vietnam, particularly religious tensions in Saigon. Government forces led by Diem's brother and sister-in-law continue to suppress the Buddhist population, which makes up about 75% of South Vietnamese citizens. Pressure mounts on urban populations, especially army officers, to convert to Catholicism. As Buddhist Zhao Duc recalls in the spring of 1963, there was tremendous pressure to become Catholic so you could get ahead, and we began hearing about a lot of secret conversions. I was incensed by what was going on, and I felt it was dangerous. The conflict reaches a dramatic turning point on June 11th, when Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc sets himself on fire in a busy Saigon intersection to protest government oppression. The shocking image of his self-immolation garners international attention. Although U.S. officials pressured Diem to implement reforms, his forces continue raiding Buddhist pagodas, exacerbating the crisis. By late 1963, U.S. officials viewed Diem's regime as increasingly untenable. In August, the U.S. became aware of plans for a military coup against Diem, led by South Vietnamese army officers. While historians debate the extent of U.S. involvement, it is clear that Washington does not intervene to stop the plot. Instead, American officials convey to the conspirators that the U.S. supports South Vietnam as a nation rather than any specific leader. On November 1st, South Vietnamese generals overthrew Diem's government in a coup. Diem and his brother are captured and executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier, a move that appears to have been unplanned. While this deeply concerns U.S. officials, they hope the new military government will take a more aggressive stance against the Viet Cong. Shortly after this dramatic event, another shocking assassination sends ripples across the world. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. At the time of his death, 16,000 U.S. advisors were stationed in Vietnam, with 100 having lost their lives. The responsibility for leading the U.S. effort in Vietnam now falls to his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson has long aspired to the presidency, but he never envisioned himself as a wartime leader. His true passion lies in domestic reforms, which he refers to as the Great Society, ambitious initiatives aimed at addressing poverty, education, and civil rights. To Johnson, Vietnam is an unwelcome diversion, consuming both time and resources that could be devoted to critical issues at home. However, 1964 is an election year, and Johnson understands that any perception of weakness in confronting international communism would be politically disastrous. Reflecting on his predicament, he later explains in his characteristically blunt style, I knew that if we let communist aggression succeed in taking over South Vietnam, there would follow an endless national debate that would shatter my presidency. I knew that Harry Truman and Dean Acheson lost their effectiveness from the day that communists took over China. And I knew that all their problems, taken together, were chicken shit compared with what might happen if we lost Vietnam. Faced with these pressures, Johnson opts to retain Kennedy's team of advisors and largely follows their recommendations regarding Vietnam. While he hopes to limit U.S. involvement, he often acquiesces to demands for further escalation. In December 1963, as the Strategic Hamlet program crumbles under corruption and mismanagement, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara warns that South Vietnam could collapse within 2 to 3 months. Johnson considers launching airstrikes or deploying ground troops, but decides to delay any major decision until after the 1964 election. For the time being, he sends additional advisors and appoints a new commander, General William Westmoreland. Known for his preference for firepower and active military operations over civilian programs and pacification, Westmoreland brings a more aggressive approach to the conflict. Covert U.S. actions in Vietnam are not new. They've been ongoing since 1961, but the U.S. consistently maintains plausible deniability. One such effort is Operational Plan 34 Alpha, OP Plan 34A, a series of commando raids along the North Vietnamese coast. Although the personnel involved may be South Vietnamese, Thai, Laotian, or Taiwanese, the operations are meticulously planned by MACV's Studies and Observations Group, a seemingly innocuous bureaucratic name for the U.S. Special Forces and Covert Command. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy conducts its own covert operations, known as DeSoto patrols. These missions involve destroyers equipped with electronic surveillance technology, tasked with detecting North Vietnamese communications and radar emissions. From the North Vietnamese perspective, these destroyers, supported by aircraft carriers, appear to be motherships coordinating the coastal raids. Although this assumption is incorrect, the close timing and proximity of DeSoto patrols and OP Plan 34A missions often blur the lines between them. In reality, while the two operations are technically separate, DeSoto patrols frequently provide intelligence for the commando raids. In July and August 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox undertook a DeSoto mission in the Gulf of Tonkin. Initially planned as a routine cruise, the mission quickly spirals into one of the most controversial episodes of the Vietnam War. On the night of July 30th, 1964, South Vietnamese O-Plan patrol boats bombard North Vietnamese coastal military installations. The next day, on August 1st, the Maddox enters the area on what is intended to be a non-provocative mission, staying outside waters the U.S. defines as North Vietnamese territory. However, the destroyer ventures as close as 14 kilometers to the North Vietnamese coast, a distance North Vietnam considers part of its territorial waters, contrary to U.S. interpretations. Believing the Maddox is responsible for the previous night's attacks, the North Vietnamese Navy dispatches 3 torpedo boats. On August 2nd, these torpedo boats approach the Maddox, prompting the destroyer to fire warning shots. The Maddox then engages the boats directly, while the torpedo boats respond by launching their torpedoes, which fail to hit their target. Returning fire, the Maddox unleashes a barrage of 265 3-inch shells, but scores only 1 hit. Although the exchange causes little damage, the encounter heightens the anxiety of the Maddox's inexperienced crew. On August 4th, the Maddox re-enters the Gulf of Tonkin, this time accompanied by the destroyer USS Turner Joy. With a moonless sky and poor visibility, the captains are already on edge, having been warned to expect additional attacks. That night, radar operators detect unknown contacts, and at 9:34 p.m., the Maddox opens fire, quickly joined by the Turner Joy. Sonar operators report multiple torpedoes in the water, and crew members claim to see their wakes, and enemy ships dot as both destroyers fire. They report damaging or sinking several enemy vessels. The Turner Joy drops depth charges and even attempts to ram an enemy ship. After 2 hours of chaotic action, the destroyers cease fire. not because the enemy disappears, but because Commander Herbert Ogier begins doubting the validity of the radar contacts. With the number of supposed sightings and torpedoes reaching implausible levels, Ogier suspects they may have fired over 300 shells at nothing. Despite this uncertainty, reports of a North Vietnamese attack are already en route to Washington. It's only on August 5th, when no debris from the supposed enemy vessels is found, that Captain John Herrick of the Maddox sends a skeptical report. However, this report does not fully deny the possibility of an attack. Captain Barnhart of the Turner Joy continues to insist the engagement was real. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff push for definitive information to present to the President. Both sides prioritize radar and torpedo sightings, even as doubts grow about their accuracy. Ultimately, both captains maintain that an attack occurred, though not at the scale initially reported. Relying on intercepted North Vietnamese Navy communications that seem to indicate a planned attack, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara presents the case for retaliation. President Johnson ordered airstrikes on August 5th against North Vietnamese coastal bases in Vinh. In the raid, 2 U.S. planes are shot down and 1 pilot is killed. On August 10th, President Johnson signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorizes him to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. While not a formal declaration of war, the resolution gives Johnson broad powers to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Congress overwhelmingly approves the resolution, with many members condemning the unprovoked attack on U.S. vessels in international waters. However, Johnson withholds information about the O-Plan and DeSoto missions, and McNamara publicly portrays the Maddox's mission as a routine patrol in international waters. The destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked, it replied to the attack and continued to carry out its mission today and will do so the remainder of this week. In the same waters, the President has asked that the destroyer force be doubled and that an air cap, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. Following the Gulf of Tonkin crisis, Johnson's approval rating remains high, and he wins a landslide victory in the November election. Despite this success, he publicly promises to avoid deploying ground troops in Vietnam. So what truly happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? The events of August 2nd are undisputed, as North Vietnam confirms the attack on the Maddox. However, there was no attack on August 4th. The supposed engagement that night stemmed from radar errors, misinterpretations, and heightened tensions. Yet it became the catalyst for a dramatic escalation in the U.S. commitment to the Vietnam War. The second incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which catalyzed U.S. escalation in Vietnam, was likely caused by a combination of radar anomalies, weather conditions, crew stress, miscommunication, and poor visibility. According to the Maddox's logs, 25 probable torpedoes were detected during the supposed attack on August 4, 1964. However, the North Vietnamese Navy possessed only 12 torpedo boats, 3 of which were damaged after the August 2nd attack, and each boat carried just 2 torpedoes. The frequent course changes of the Maddox likely created sonar echoes that mimicked multiple incoming torpedoes, confusing the crew. Had a genuine attack occurred, North Vietnam would likely have confirmed it for propaganda purposes, but they consistently denied it. The intercepted North Vietnamese messages McNamara relied on were likely mistranslations, referring to the retrieval of damaged ships from the August 2nd engagement rather than planning a new attack. Some historians have speculated that the US might have fabricated the second incident as a pretext for war, though most conclude this is unlikely. However, it's possible some evidence was misrepresented, and President Johnson may have been aware of the full details by the time he addressed Congress. Yet, having already made public declarations about the attack and his intention to respond, Johnson pressed forward, declaring, "The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response for the present will be limited and fitting." Although Johnson secured the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, he hesitated to fully utilize it. US planners compiled lists of bombing targets in North Vietnam, but initially held back. Instead, American planes began secretly bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. This restraint ended in early 1965. On February 7th, Viet Cong forces attacked American advisors at Camp Holloway, killing 8 Americans and destroying or damaging 25 aircraft. Days later, on February 10th, a bomb attack on another barracks killed 23 more Americans. Outraged, Johnson declared, "We have kept our gun over the mantle and our shells in the cupboard for a long time now. And what was the result? They're killing our boys while they sleep in the night." On February 24th, US aircraft began bombing North Vietnamese targets between the 17th and 19th parallels, initiating what would become Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign aimed at bolstering South Vietnamese morale and pressuring North Vietnam to abandon the Viet Cong. Although primarily an air campaign, the US soon recognized the need for ground troops to protect its air bases. On March 8, 1965, 2 Marine battalions landed in Da Nang to provide security. Their presence provoked further Viet Cong attacks. The bombing campaign also failed to significantly hinder Viet Cong activities. Instead, North Vietnam increased its infiltration efforts, with regular troops occasionally crossing the 17th parallel. In response, the Soviet Union and China, previously more passive, began supplying North Vietnam with anti-aircraft weapons. Meanwhile, South Vietnam's government remained in disarray. Since Diem's assassination, 5 successive military governments had taken power, all ineffective. U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense William Bundy described the latest ruling generals, Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Sao Ky, as absolutely the bottom of the barrel. General Westmoreland concluded that the ARVN could not hold the line without further U.S. involvement. By July 1965, Johnson approved the deployment of 50,000 troops for offensive operations, marking a significant escalation. The deepening U.S. involvement in Vietnam stemmed primarily from the fear of communist expansion. South Vietnam, though far from a democratic state, was viewed as a critical bulwark against communism. This perspective is made clear in a secret 1965 U.S. memorandum. The U.S. objective in South Vietnam is not to help a friend but to contain China. Other factors played a role as well. Abandoning South Vietnam after making public commitments would have been a global and personal humiliation for Johnson. The shadow of Kennedy's legacy also loomed large, compelling Johnson to honor his predecessor's policies. Some historians suggest Kennedy had been considering a withdrawal before his assassination, but Johnson chose to stay the course. American leaders were also confident in their ability to win. Many believed the communist success up to 1965 was due not to their strength, but to U.S. restraint and the ineffectiveness of the French and South Vietnamese. They thought that once the U.S. fully committed, the situation would quickly change. However, there were also racial undertones to American perceptions. Disappointed by the ARVN's poor performance, some U.S. commanders extended this judgment to all Vietnamese, underestimating their determination and capabilities. Johnson's advisors, particularly McNamara, placed immense faith in the military superiority of U.S. firepower. They believed this, combined with McNamara's analytical approach, could deliver results with near mathematical precision. Yet, there was little discussion about contingencies if their strategies failed. Not everyone shared this optimism. Under Secretary of State George Ball repeatedly argued that victory was impossible, while other officials recognized that the Viet Cong's grassroots support and ideological dedication made them an incredibly formidable foe. In 1964, David Ness, the deputy chief of mission in Saigon, warned, "The Viet Cong represents a grassroots movement which is disciplined, ideologically dedicated, easily identifiable with the desires of the peasantry, and of course, ruthless." American soldiers arriving in Vietnam would soon learn just how ruthless and complex the war would become.